Welcome to Healing Voices with Pastor Dave Watson. Each day, this program will seek to provide insights and answers to the overwhelming issues our nation and city are facing. Pastor Dave and his guests will provide a Christian commentary on current events as well as scripturally sound solutions for the issues of the day. Pastor Dave has served as the senior pastor of Calvary Chapel on Staten Island for over 30 years. He's also the co-founder and president of the New York Institute for Biblical Studies. To download the podcast of this broadcast, find out more about Healing Voices, or support the program, please go to nycshepherd.com. That's nycshepherd.com. Now, here's Pastor Dave with today's broadcast.
Well, welcome back. This is another edition of Healing Voices. My name is Pastor Dave Watson. I'm the pastor of Calvary Chapel on Staten Island. I've been there for 31 years. I also broadcast, or have the privilege of broadcasting, our church does, at 11:30 every Sunday morning right here on WMCA 570, The Mission. And one of the things that we're trying to do here with Healing Voices is, watch this, bring some healing to our city. Our city is suffering more and more rupture, best I can tell. And maybe what we need is the people of God, and maybe the leaders of the people of God, the pastors, to sit down and just have a discussion. Maybe have the hard discussion we always say we're going to have. And I'm privileged today to be joined by, full disclosure, a friend of over 25 years, Dr. Lawrence Taylor, the pastor of Kenilworth Baptist Church in Brooklyn. Dr. Taylor, welcome to Healing Voices.
Well, thank you for having me.
How could I do a show without you? Dr. Taylor has been pastoring at Kenilworth Baptist for 22 years. He was a New York City school teacher, sometimes serving as dean when they twisted his arm for 33 years. He's taught history for over 30 years. He is entrenched in this city. So it's a privilege to have him, and it's a privilege to get his healing voice in the middle of this time together. And just so we start and everyone understands, obviously I'm a different color, different hue than Dr. Taylor. I wasn't brought up in the city. I was brought up in Western Massachusetts. And I've never had to have a tough discussion with my son about the police. I've told my son, if you're a knucklehead, you're a knucklehead. Tell the cops I was a knucklehead, and it'll go from there. Dr. Taylor, it hadn't been that way necessarily for you and your family. Am I correct?
That's correct. That is absolutely correct.
I mean, what do you tell your children, or what have you told them?
Well, my children are grown now, but when they were growing up, my wife and I had discussions with them about how they are to conduct themselves. If they were confronted by the police, that they are to be courteous, that they are never to talk back, and that they have to recognize the fact that as black males, because I have 3 black sons, that there is at least a perception out there that there's a disparity in treatment between how the police treat black males and how they treat others. So we had to always coach them. And fortunately, I never got into any serious trouble, and I thank God for that.
Amen. It's frightening. It's discouraging. It's not something you want your kids to have to deal with. Now, we saw a horrific murder played over and over again, the taking of the life of George Floyd. There were some other serious incidences leading up to that. Did that particularly affect your church? I mean, you pastor a church that has a lot of Western Caribbean folks in it, mostly dark skin. Did the death of George Floyd affect your congregation? Did the protests affect what was going on within your church family?
Well, my members were obviously sympathetic with the cause, and of course, many of them have sons and daughters. And just like my wife and I had to coach our children, they do the same with their children. But they, and a lot of their children, unfortunately, have had problems. And they obviously reach out to me as pastor to tell me about some of the problems that their children have had with the police. Now, I'm not saying that every case that that these young people are innocent, but the concern of the parents is whether they're going to see their child hurt or not. That's their major concern. It's the George Floyd case, but there's so many other cases besides the George Floyd case that never make it to the media, and many of the people in our community are aware of some of these cases. So, the George Floyd case did have an impact.
So, as a pastor, when you see your folks hurting like this, do you find that you need to address it in some way? I mean, from the pulpit, do you need to address it? I mean, how do you handle it?
Yeah. You need to address it from the pulpit. You need to address it in terms of teaching of Scripture and contextualizing it. I had the police in that area come and meet with the young people. And I got to tell you something. When I asked the police to come, they were eager to come and speak to the young people. But some of the young people and some of the adults resented the presence of the police. And some were even angry at me for inviting the police to come. Wow.
The level of distrust is just so high.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, as I've looked through the Bible a lot, you and I, full disclosure, we have our Doctor of Ministry at the same time from the same place. Though Dr. Taylor looks much younger than I, he has a couple years on me. But we got our Doctor of Ministry. It's a few Doctor of Ministry at the same time. Although Taylor was slightly ahead in the alphabet at the same location. But I've read the scriptures. I've looked through them, and I don't find the word racism in the Bible. I find a concept of hate and a concept of being proud and arrogant of one's ethnicity, and the problems that follow that. Is it possible that by always using the word racism that it loses its power, the phrase, because we don't actually know what it fully means, or do we just intuitively know what it means and we go from there?
Well, you're not going to find racism in antiquity. You're not going to find it in the during biblical times, because you don't have that kind of race consciousness like we have today. Let me just give you an example of what I mean real quickly. In 2 Samuel, you have a reference to a Cushite. This is when Absalom is killed. Absalom is killed, and then the son of the priest wants to bring the news to David. Joab doesn't think that's such a good idea, the general, so he says, no, let's get the Cushite to do it. Now, some people may think, well, and the Cushite obviously is referring to a black man in this case. Right. Because Cushite meant one of dark skin. So, but there's no racism there, because when the Cushite runs to bring the news to David, David doesn't see a black man. David just says, I see two men. Makes no reference to the color of this man's skin, because you didn't have that kind of race consciousness in the ancient world.
What do you think has made us so conscious in that regard?
Well, I got to be honest with you. I think in terms of, and this is based on my own studies, of course, in terms of what we have in America, race consciousness grew out of slavery. In terms of being aware of the fact that one is white and one was black, that grew out of the institution of slavery in the United States. And so we do live in a very race-conscious society. There's no question about that. There's been, unfortunately, a preoccupation with race. And this is well documented.
So because of slavery and the history of slavery, we have this horrible plight on our country, and this division of people. My concern is that the church itself is struggling with a race issue. I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King have reported to say famously that the most segregated hour of the week is 11 a.m. Am I correct about that?
Yeah. Yes. That's correct. Yeah, and a number of people said that, but yeah, King said that too. That's correct. 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yes.
So where did that tradition come? I mean, does that come primarily from back in the day, we would say, the slaves and then when they were freed, black people were not welcomed in any of our churches?
And of course, when you say our churches, you mean in white churches?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
American churches.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two reasons why maybe more than two reasons why you have black churches and white churches and various other ethnic groups. But in America, the reason why is because, one, blacks were not given, obviously, equal treatment. I don't know if you know the story of Richard Allen and the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. How they were at an Episcopal church. I think it was called the St. George Episcopal Church, and blacks were not allowed to come to the altar and pray at the same time as whites. This is just a small example. So Richard Allen and Absalom Jones insisted on doing it at the same time as whites, and they were thrown out of the church. So that's why they started the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But listen, in all fairness, even during slavery, we know that blacks preferred to listen to black preachers. That was also their preference. So we know that from slave narratives, blacks would say, hey, listen, I prefer the black preacher because we feel that he identifies more with our plight and with our situation. So on the one hand, it was a preference. On the other hand, it was because of discrimination. But that kind of discrimination continued. Then I don't know if you know this, in 1960, there was a publication that came out of Bob Jones University. And the title of it is discrimination. Is separation, I think, of the races.
Segregation?
Segregation scriptural. Okay. And so you have this long theological defense by Bob Jones defending segregation. Well, that was the way it was. In most white churches, blacks were not welcomed.
Well, you remember Jimmy Carter, when he ran for president, had to disavow in a sense, his church in Plains, Georgia, because it still in 1976 had had a no blacks rule when it came to membership or something that effect. Do you recall that?
I remember the details of that. This, Jimmy Carter was a liberal Democrat, as we recall. He had a history of that, but he attended a church that actually incorporated in their charter that blacks are not allowed. The Republicans put a plant there. They put a black guy.
Oh, no.
This was done by the Republicans, okay? They sent a black guy to the church. And so this would get lots of publicity. This is when Jimmy Carter was running. So they could show that Jimmy Carter attended a segregated church. Now, they had a young pastor there who was actually opposed to the policy of segregation in Carter's church. But this was a long tradition in his church. And so it got plenty of publicity because this was politics. There's no question about that.
Absolutely.
But it did give, it was an embarrassing thing for Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter admitted, though he didn't want to in the beginning, he admitted, this is my church has in its charter that blacks are not allowed to attend. The pastor corrected Jimmy Carter on that and said, no, that's not what the charter says. The charter says clearly that, and use the N-word, are not allowed to attend.
Oh, my.
Okay, so eventually this young pastor had to leave.
Wow. This is Pastor Dave Watson. You're listening to Healing Voices, our attempt, by the grace of God, to have a good and fervent discussion regarding the issues of race in our city. My guest is Dr. Lawrence Taylor, pastor of the Kenilworth Baptist Church in Brooklyn. When I read the book of Acts, I come to Acts 13, and I see the leadership at the church at Antioch. And it seems to me that leadership is multi-ethnic, multicultural, and that church was the same. Why have we left that model? Why is that so rare now? Shouldn't we look back at that and say this is what we aspire to be like that?
Yeah, we should. Yes, absolutely. But unfortunately, our cultural practices, what we were taught by our parents and our grandparents, sometimes has a stronger impact than what we see in Scripture. So sometimes the cultural mandate will supersede what the biblical mandate requires. And of course, that's a commentary on the church.
Absolutely. The other thing that troubles me, and it troubles me greatly, and maybe you can help me through it. I'm reading some books, keeping my head in this issue, and I'm finding that some Puritan preachers, and I think we all look up to, in one level or another, to the Puritans, to their writings, their passion for God. But I've noted that it seems that there are Puritan preachers who had slaves, that there were not just people who were writing the Constitution. That's another issue. But Puritan preachers, my daughter will say to me, "If you love Jesus, how in the world could you possibly be someone who would own another human being?" What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Puritans weren't that pure. Okay, that's my thought. I mean, there are many things that there are some things that the Puritans engaged in that we can't hold up as a sterling model. The way the treatment of Native Americans.
Yes.
Even the treatment of other groups like the Quakers. The way they treated the Quakers, 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 I didn't know if you know there was a large, a severe persecution of Quakers by the Puritans.
Well, if you're going to persecute somebody who's nonviolent. I've always said that.
Yes, and the fact that and even go after witches and they also held to the institution of slavery. Yes, they now the people even like Cotton Mather.
Yes.
Yeah, who was of course somebody who is revered. But he was not opposed to the institution of slavery.
It's just it's difficult for me to fathom. I know a little bit about your conversion experience, and I know in my own life that I was influenced heavily by some people in my neighborhood who were very much racially disparaging, very, very much so. And so I didn't have the greatest view of people of color. But when I came to Christ, I found that I could not think about people that way anymore. That something had changed in my heart. And I just said, how could I have possibly said that? How could I have possibly thought that? But so it's hard for me to fathom that there are people who love Christ who were comfortable owning slaves, or in the South, pastors, preachers who would defend segregation. Isn't that incongruent with our faith?
Well, yeah, it's a clear incongruity. I absolutely agree with you, but nevertheless, it's a fact, and that I think it's something that at least people should be aware of. That kind of inconsistency. Listen, let's talk about seminaries.
Yeah.
Evangelical seminaries. In the case of even Dallas Theological Seminary, we're talking about one of the premier seminaries of in the evangelical community. Well, they practice segregation. The founder of that, one of the founders of that seminary, Louis Berry Chafer. Later on, Harry Ironside, who taught there. Their policy was that they would not admit blacks. And in fact, Ironside established a separate school for blacks because they didn't want them to attend Dallas Seminary.
Wow. This is Pastor Dave Watson. You've been listening to Healing Voices here on WMCA 570. My guest has been Dr. Lawrence Taylor from the Kenilworth Baptist Church, and a broadcaster here on our radio station, 7 p.m. on Sunday evenings. Dr. Taylor will be a regular guest with us here on Healing Voices. I know that his voice and his perspective will be a blessing to you. Dr. Taylor, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to our next discussion.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's broadcast. To download the podcast of this broadcast, find out more about Healing Voices, or support the program, please go to nycshepherd.com. That's nycshepherd.com. To get a free CD of the broadcast, please call 718-720-5394. That's 718-720-5394. Healing Voices is an extension of the ministry of Pastor Dave Watson, Calvary Chapel, and God in Our City. Please join us every weekday at this time for another edition of Healing Voices with Pastor Dave Watson. Until next time, may our God richly bless you as you serve Him.
We humble ourselves.